Welcome, everybody. As you are all aware, it's a great pleasure to have Dr. Bruce Allen Wallace here. And we know each other for many years. And to the great delight to my ear, this morning when we were sitting and talking, he told me, and he will probably say more, that he was the first student in the library when the library opened. Imagine. So Dr. Bruce Allen is an, of course, American author and expert on Tibetan Buddhism. In 1987, Wallace obtained a BA in Physics, Philosophy of Science, and Sanskrit from Amherst College, followed in 1995 by a PhD in Religious Studies from Stanford University. His doctoral dissertation was on the cultivation of sustained voluntary attention in Indo-Tibetan Buddhism. He taught for 4 years in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of California at Santa Barbara. Wallace founded the Santa Barbara Institute of Consciousness Studies in 2003 with the objective of furthering such interdisciplinary and cross-cultural investigation of the nature and potentials of consciousness and extending its benefits to the general public. One of the Institute's projects is the Samatha project, a longitudinal scientific study of the effect of intensive meditation training. This developed into the International Samatha Project, ISP. Dr. Wallace worked with psychologist Paul Ekman and Eve Ekman on the Cultivating Emotional Balance, CEB project for over 20 years. Wallace has led workshops on dream yoga and has collaborated with Stephen LaBerge. His life's works focuses on deep engagement between Buddhist philosophical and contemplative inquiry and modern science and philosophy, with a special emphasis on exploring the nature and potentials of the mind in a radically empirical manner, as free as possible from the dogma of religion and materialism. Wallace grew up in America and Switzerland, but left college after 3 years to study Buddhism in India to come to library. He served as interpreter for many Buddhist contemplatives and scholars, including His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Since 1976, Wallace has taught Buddhism, philosophy, and meditation in Asia, Europe, North and South America, and Australia. Having devoted 14 years to training as a Tibetan Buddhist monk, ordained by His Holiness Dalai Lama, with his unique background, Allen brings deep experience and applied skills to the challenge of integrating traditional Indo-Tibetan Buddhism with the modern world. In 2010, Wallace became the director and chairman of the Phuket International Academy Mind Center, which provides a blend of contemporary psychology and neuroscience alongside ancient Asian contemplative practices. His books discuss Eastern and Western scientific, I think there are 40-something, I don't know how many books.
I don't either.
And we made a list and there is a poster we are putting downstairs. Philosophical and contemplative modes of inquiry, often focusing on the relationship he sees between science and Buddhism. It is my great pleasure to have such a dynamic lecturer, progressive scholar, and one of the most prolific writers and translators of Tibetan Buddhism in the West. The book that I'm carrying here, which I read, many of these books, deals with the cutting edge science and technology and so forth. So still, at this juncture, there is a lot of discussion whether there's a life afterwards or not, whether there is anything called mind other than the workings of the brain. So many interesting topics which is really, really difficult to fathom. Okay? So that's an area that we can explore. And especially if we do it for the benefit of the mankind, it's endless. So I'm glad really to have a person like him who is really immersed in Buddhism and also science. Not only, when I say Buddhism, it's not just the intellectual understanding, but I know that right from the beginning, when he attempted to actually develop Samatha and meditated, I don't know, 6 months or something, here in Dharamsala, with another great teacher, Gen Lamrimba. I know both of them. And he always aspired to really go into the deep and cultivate some of this, real stuff, the Buddhist practices, not just some understanding and then doing no practice, not like that. So I highly admire him. And then especially I admire you because he has always been thinking about how to contribute back to the Tibetan community and to serve His Holiness Dalai Lama. And we had long discussion this morning how we can collaborate and do something together. And now both of us are getting old.
Yeah.
So we were this morning we were discussing, let us do something that will outlive our life. Okay. So I'm glad that you all are showing interest. And normally when I give a talk, then I tell people, okay, I don't want to talk more because this is like preaching the converts, So you're all good people. So I'm really, from that point of view, I'm really glad that so many good people wanting to do good things, listen to good things. So without standing in between you and Dr. Ellis, the floor is yours, and kindly welcome him with a thunderous clapping hands.
Oh yeah, it's really a pleasure being with you today. It's also very much of an honor. As Geshe-la mentioned, when I first came here, it was 1971, and I came to Dharamsala specifically because the library was opening. And a Lama with whom I was studying in Switzerland said, don't think about any other place. I wanted to find some cave in Nepal. I just hunkered down in a cave for the next 30 years. That didn't turn out. But this bulletin came, and the Lama I was training with in Switzerland said, this library, this is directly under the auspice of His Holiness Dalai Lama. Don't think of any other place. So I made a beeline here. And when I arrived, so I was 21, and just recently His Holiness was we were having Skype conversation a little bit, and His Holiness told the other people in the room, when he came to Dharamsala, he was a boy. He was a boy. It's really true. And then when I saw His Holiness last May in Pisa, he took one look at me and said, oh, si keram potachasha. You become an old geezer. So I'm a boy to geezer. Where did the years go? But actually they've been very happy years. Pretty much only practicing Dharma, studying Dharma, trying to do some good, at least more good than bad. So I think maybe it's okay. If I died now, maybe okay. Maybe in the balance, okay. I think so. So tonight, or this afternoon, I'd like to address a topic, I think one of the most important topics in the modern world. It's about the nature of the mind. And right now the stakes are very high. The gravity of the question and the way it's being dealt with by various groups, our whole destiny hinges on the nature of the mind, because the nature of our own identity as human beings, human nature, is absolutely bound up in the mind. So if it's true that the mind is nothing more than a brain function, then we are nothing more than a brain function. And brain acts according to the laws of physics and chemistry, which means we're robots, right? And then of course we have the lights turn out when they're dead, and that's it. So there's one view, but this afternoon I'd like to focus on a Buddhist science of the mind, and I say with great reverence, really. There are many aspects of the Buddha Dharma, particularly in Tibetan Buddhism, for example, that are clearly, in terms of Western terminology, are religious. No question about it. And I honor those, I participate in that. I'm not in any way cool or anti-religious whatsoever, but there are large areas of Buddhism that from a Western perspective we say, well, that's religious. And then when we look into Madhyamaka, Yogacara, Svatantrika, Vasubandhu, Vaivachika, and so forth, there's no question. Many elements of Buddhism are clearly philosophical, using the Western terminological grid. But then the question, are there elements in Buddhism that are truly scientific, that worthy of that name? And I'll be making my case this afternoon, following in the footsteps of my root Lama, His Holiness Dalai Lama, that the answer is yes. But we'll spend just a short time before going to the Buddhist perspective on the nature of mind to look at the West, because after all, we're using a Western term. The term science didn't exist in Tibetan until they created a term, Senrik, to correspond to the Western terms. So since this is a Western term, let's look a little bit, this will be very short, at the history of this. During the time of Galileo, of course, the word scientist didn't exist. 17th century, 18th century didn't exist. The word scientist didn't even come into usage until the mid-19th century. But so at that time they were called natural philosophers. So Galileo, I think, was the first great natural philosopher, which we nowadays call a scientist. And he was clearly the father of, or the founder of, the scientific revolution. And so what was a key feature of that? Because people had been interested in the stars, planets, sun and moon for a very long time before him, but there was something very distinctive about him, in fact, various things, that gave rise to his becoming, I think, the first fully qualified scientist. And that is, he made very careful observations, and he used technology, and he had hypotheses, and he put them to the test of experimentation, and he was a brilliant mathematician. So he had all of the qualities. Copernicus was a great mathematician, but he made no observations at all. I'm not sure he ever even looked up at the sky. But very good mathematician, but that's not enough to be a scientist. Galileo was the full package. And so what was characteristic of him and his establishing or triggering the scientific revolution is that he rigorously observed physical, celestial, sun, moon, stars, and planets, and terrestrial phenomena, dropping balls off the Tower of Pisa and so forth. And by this rigorous observation, really looking carefully at the phenomena he was seeking to understand, he launched a revolution in the physical sciences, and therefore the father of modern science. That's the opinion of Einstein. I'll go with Einstein. And so he came out with his first seminal book in 1610, I think, The Starry Messenger, in which he revealed some of his earliest discoveries. And then from 1609 to 1859, so there's 250 years, we just whip right through. 1859 was the year that Charles Darwin published Origin of the Species, and so, of course, the theory of evolution. And how did he come upon this? How did he develop this theory in the same spirit as Galileo? It was decades, 25 years of very careful observation of biological phenomena, first in Great Britain, and then, of course, his famous circumambulation around the Earth. And so tremendous observation, power of observation, and on the basis of his very careful observations, then he developed the theory of natural selection, of biological evolution, and he launched a revolution in the life sciences. Now move forward, 1890 or so, that's when William James, one of the great pioneers of modern psychology, published his monumental work, 2-volume work, Principles of Psychology. He was in the first generation of Western scientists of mind, psychologists. Those individuals like Edward Titchener, Wilhelm Wundt, William James, these were all contemporaries, they were all pioneers of seeking to do something that had never been done in the West before, and that is take the study of the science of the mind or the soul out of the realm of theology, out of the realm of philosophy, and try to bring it into the realm of experimental, empirical science, like all the other branches of the natural sciences. So they wanted to make it, one more of the sciences, physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, in the same mood. And so with that same mood, he proposed that psychologists, like Darwin, like Galileo, rigorously observed the phenomena they were seeking to understand. And these, of course, when it comes to the mind, were mental phenomena. So he suggested, let's take a radically empirical approach to mental phenomena, as we've previously done with physical phenomena and biological phenomena. But now, of course, there's a catch, and that is the great successes of science up until William James entailed looking outwards. That careful observation was always directed outwards to the objective, the physical, and the quantifiable. But now you want to be equally empirical, carefully observe the phenomena you're seeking to understand, but the catch is they're not objective, they're subjective, they're not physical, they have no physical attributes, they're non-physical, and they're not quantitative. If you ask, how many units of emotion did you have when you had some emotional experience? It's impossible. It's qualitative. So can you still be truly scientific while observing something, carefully observing something that, again, only you can observe? That is, when you observe your thoughts. How does anybody else know that you're telling the truth when you report on it? So you have first person, where scientists, multiple scientists, can watch somebody dropping balls off the Tower of Pisa, and you have the third person perspective. It's public, right? But when you're observing your mind, your thoughts, your images, your desires, and so forth, it's not third person. So can you do that scientifically? Well, after about 35 years or so of some very kind of baby steps into the field of introspective psychology, then around 1910, around the same year that William James died, that whole movement of introspectionist psychology was basically snuffed out like a candle. And it was snuffed out largely for not practical reasons or empirical reasons, but for ideological reasons. and these were the ideology of naturalism and the dogma of scientism. So let's look briefly at that. Naturalism is the user-friendly, marketing-savvy word. The words that are not so savvy in terms of marketing and getting converts are materialism, which sounds a little bit grotty, and physicalism, which sounds rather cool. But naturalism kind of sounds nice, but it's the same message. Naturalism is, and many scientists, and many people who are not scientists, embrace this worldview. It's an ontological commitment to the world as being natural. And then what do you mean by natural? Well, I've asked many psychologists and others, and they pretty much answer by negative terms. By natural, I mean, not supernatural. Then I say, what do you mean by supernatural? Well, like God and angels and devils and heaven and hell and so forth. So in the naturalistic view of reality, there are no supernatural causes like divine intervention or demons or spirits, angels and so forth. There are no supernatural entities. And there is also, that's the ontological commitment, and the epistemological commitment is to the best scientific means to regulate one's inquiry. In other words, if you want to know it's true, find a scientific method, because those are the methods that have proven effective for the last 300-400 years, and those methods that are not scientific haven't given rise to that type of consensual knowledge. In terms of scientism, this is kind of like the radical wing of scientific materialism, and there are many people who embrace this today. They assert that science is our only source of genuine knowledge about the world. Everything else is just subjective opinion, belief, speculation, religious dogma. It's almost like a religious creed, like having the only religion. So advocates of scientism say there's only one way. Ever heard that phrase before? There's only one way. And these are the advocates of scientism, not to salvation, but to knowing reality as it is. And it is the only way to understand humanity's place in the world. So whether it's your human psyche or anything about human nature, science is the only way to find out, for science provides the only credible view of the world as a whole. That's from Auguste Comte. So that's been around for more than a century, and I think it's growing in its influence. There we go. So this gives rise to an epistemological hierarchy, and it reminds me a lot of medieval epistemological hierarchy, where theology was the queen of sciences, theology was the highest form of knowledge there is, and beneath that was logic and philosophy. Philosophy was the handmaiden of theology, and beneath that was the knowledge of the senses, which was considered to be very feeble and superficial and misleading. That was medieval kind of hierarchy, but the hierarchy from the 20th century right into the 21st century for many people is first of all a commitment to the ontological and epistemological beliefs of naturalism. So assume that first, and then beneath that is reason, but reason is to serve that paradigm, and then you can have experience, but only kinds of experience that conform to the beliefs of naturalism. So if you have some kind of experiences like a vision of God, or you have precognition, or you see a spirit, or you have past life recall, that just doesn't count. That just doesn't count. That's just not evidence at all, because that evidence is contrary to the beliefs of naturalism. So especially over the last 20 years or so, the issue of consciousness has become a hotter and hotter topic, and especially in philosophy, but very much so really for the first time, is kind of front and center on the table. What is the nature of consciousness? This is an issue being grappled with by neuroscientists, by psychologists, of course philosophers and others. Even physicists are jumping into the fray. And in terms of the scientific study of mind and consciousness, that's been going on now for about 140 years. And we can say after 140 years, here's some simply objective facts of where are we in the year 2017. I think it's quite clear there's a consensus that there is no consensus in terms of a scientific definition of consciousness. There's something like 250 definitions of consciousness, which is like, different lineages of a religion. They don't agree at all, and none of them are rising above the rest of them to gain some kind of an authority. So it's something that they can't even define. Now, when it comes to consciousness, again, now they're looking outwards to the physical, the objective, the quantifiable, and you can, if you had something like a Geiger counter, but a Geiger counter for consciousness, that could tell you if you focus it on one of those insect-eating plants, Are you curious whether insect-eating plants enjoy the insects? Like they, smack their lips afterward? Do they have some experience? Or is it just a mechanical response? Like nowadays, artificial intelligence. Many, many mechanical responses, but do they actually know anything? Does like Watson, the great computer, does it actually experience anything, know anything, or are they simply highly sophisticated programs that are responding stimuli? And so the point here is, I think there's a large consensus here, is that there is no scientific means of objecting the presence of consciousness in anything. Not in plants, not in robots, not in unborn babies, not in people who are in the vegetative state. You can't measure it at all scientifically, objectively. Maybe there's good reason for that. It's not objective. And then even what are the neurocorrelates of consciousness? I know one of the leading people in the field, Professor Christoph Koch, and he invited me to Caltech a few years ago. We had 11 hours of conversation, very bracing conversation. He came to the big meeting in Depung, a world-class neuroscientist, and he worked for years at Caltech, seeking what he called the NCC, the neural correlates of consciousness. What's the minimal amount of neural activity in the brain that is sufficient for generating consciousness? They didn't find it. And then he left Caltech and went to the Allen Institute for Brain Science. And so, no, they really don't know. Just, they're assuming, of course, almost without question, that the brain generates consciousness. But then you don't need all of the brain. There's a young woman in Germany right now, very clearly documented scientifically. She's born with a half a brain. And she's alive and well, an IQ of 125, something like that, very good sense of humor. But she literally has one half of her skull filled with fluid, basically water. But she's not a half a person. And so they don't know. But then we come down to what are the necessary and sufficient causes of consciousness? What is needed, necessary, and what is sufficient to generate consciousness? The answer is don't know. Okay, ignorance of how the brain generates, you don't have it either, how the brain generates or even influences mental states. Why is it that if you drink a quart of arak, your mind changes, yes? I haven't tried it actually, but it does change, yeah? How is it that alcohol changes your subjective experience? That it changes the chemical constitution and functioning of your brain? That makes perfectly good sense. But how do you go from alcohol to singing silly songs and having a really ridiculous sense of humor and not being able to walk straight and then wanting to vomit? And so they don't know. They don't know. They don't know how the brain even influences subjective mental states, or for that matter, the so-called placebo effect, taking some sugar tablet that you think is medication, and then with desire, expectation, belief, faith, and trust, in many cases, right in accordance with what you expect happens, that does happen in your brain. Total mystery. Total mystery. So how does that happen? Don't know. So we're basically, I call this, let me see what I call that, the blind spot. The blind spot in the naturalist vision of reality. You know what a blind spot is? It's the back of your retina. There's a point where the optic nerve touches the back. And in that particular part of the retina, your visual perception is getting no signal. Just no signal, like a cell phone. So if what your brain does, your brain mind does, is that it's in fact right about here. If you had a pencil and you look straight ahead and you move that pencil around, at one point the pencil would disappear. It's just not there. But you don't have two black holes in your visual field. Your brain mind photoshops. Really, it photoshops your vision. It fills it in with the colors around where the black spot would be. It literally photoshops. It's quite cool. Well, this is what's happening here. It's a blind spot, and that is in the scientific vision of reality, the whole of reality. When it comes to consciousness, it's a blind spot. It's no signal. I mean, you look at all of this no knowledge. It's pretty much no knowledge at all, scientifically. But what happens? The scientific community, brushes it, paintbrushes, something like that? Yeah, they Photoshop it. And they give the impression, oh yeah, we got this one handled. Don't worry, we got it handled. And then you say, yeah, what exactly do you know? Blind spot. There's another blind spot. I'm having a hard time with this. Let me see if I can do this correctly. Boom, boom, boom. Yeah, this was the final slide I added about half an hour ago. Thomas Huxley, very famous biologist. He was the Darwin's bulldog. You can see when he lived. He was a contemporary of Darwin. Very fine biologist. He was the founder and editor-in-chief of Nature magazine, one of the most prestigious scientific journals in the world. And so he wrote, a long time ago, how it is that anything so remarkable as a state of consciousness comes about as a result of irritating nervous tissue. Nowadays we say stimulating neurons. How is it? That's so remarkable. This is just as unaccountable as the appearance of a jinn or a genie when Aladdin rubbed his lamp. It's magical thinking. To think you've got these neurons made of chemicals and electricity, and you stimulate with some electricity, and the love of your mother is going to pop out. Or an emotion, or desire, or bodhicitta, or realization of emptiness. I want them to stimulate those neurons in me. I'm waiting, for the realization they're not coming. So, but how do you go from stimulating neurons to having a subjective experience? He said, this is magical thinking. This is like thinking rubbing a lamp, you're going to have a genie popping out. So he was a real hardcore materialist. But when it came to consciousness, he said, this doesn't really make any sense. And I was listening watching a video of a Harvard neuroscientist just a few days ago. And he did a wonderful job of demythologizing the brain. Because we hear so much nowadays in the popular media, scientific literature, that the neurons are sending message back and forth, and these remember this, and images, visual images in this part of the brain, and your emotions are in this part of the brain, and these neurons are sending message to these neurons. It sounds like a beehive or an anthill. And I've actually heard one neuroscientist at Columbia saying that you have 900 billion neurons in your brain. I think that it's more like 100 billion. And she said each of them knows who they are. So she's suggesting you got like 100 billion, 900 billion sentient beings inside your head. The problem is you're not one of them. So it's basically neuronal possession. Some people are possessed by demons, right? We're possessed by neurons. And they're the ones who are conscious. This is called, all of that, what I just said, is neuromythology. It sounds scientific. It's all make-believe. It's all make-believe. All of the statements I said, there's no basis in reality at all. This neuroscientist, Harvard neuroscientist, he kind of clarified the neuromythology. Would you like to know what's actually inside your brain? You ready? I need a drum roll. Fat, protein, water, electricity. That's it. Doesn't sound very magical to me. And the notion that that produces bodhicitta. Which part? The fat, the protein, the water, electricity? Or did they just all get it together? So we're starting with a big mystery, and at least he was very honest, saying, if we're starting here, we're starting on very thin ice, basically magical thinking. And then neuroscientist Donald Hoffman, who is really quite remarkable. He's worth listening to. Go to YouTube and check this guy out. He's very good. And he's mainstream. He's a very fine professor of neuroscience. He also, unlike almost all neuroscientists, is pretty up to date when it comes to modern physics. He really is following closely. Hardly any of them do. Most neuroscientists are living in the 19th century when it comes to physics, because that's when they stopped studying physics. They stopped studying physics after Newtonian mechanics and electromagnetism. But Donald Hoffman's comments here, directly relative to the preceding quote. Now, Huxley knew that both brain activity and conscious experiences are correlated. That's very true. But he didn't know why. To the science of his day, it was a mystery. This is called the mind-body problem. In the years since Huxley, science has learned a lot about brain activity, but the relationship between brain activity and conscious experiences is still a mystery. And I think it's not harsh to say, it's not incorrect to say, it's as much a mystery now as it was during the time of Huxley. There's a good reason for that. There are many reasons for that, but one of them is that many, many neuroscientists, psychologists, and so forth are acting as if this mind-body problem is already solved. They're just saying the mind is what the brain does. Next. The mind is what the brain does. That's their little motto. But has anybody actually proved that? No. They just got talking that way and it caught on. It's rather like, I just came from beer with a lot of dogs. You know what happens to a dog? One dog barks, and then two, and then 5 and 10. Just dogs start barking, and they all start barking the same way. This is dogs barking when you have no evidence. So along comes a breath of fresh air right there at the beginnings of modern psychology, William James, who was one of the most open-minded, least dogmatic intellectuals, scientists, philosophers, scholars of the modern era, in my opinion. And he's seeking to create, or at least contribute to, the development of a brand new science. Because before then, all they had was theology of the soul and philosophy of mind galore, but no consensus whatsoever among the many philosophers who thought about the mind. So William James, who was famous for his spirit of radical empiricism, proposed this as a strategy for the scientific study of the mind. He comments here, introspective observation is what we have to rely on first and foremost and always. The word introspection need hardly be defined. It means, of course, the looking into our minds and reporting what we there discover. And everyone agrees that we there discover states of consciousness. So I love the kind of the unitive or integrative proposal or strategy that he was proposing. Because right here he's saying introspective observation should be first and foremost. But he also advocated or commented that by studying people's behavior, how they speak, their facial expression, body language, based on behavior, we can draw a lot of inferential knowledge about what's going on in their minds. If they laugh, they're probably happy. If they're weeping, they're probably sad, and so on, with much greater nuance. So he suggested, well, study behavior, that's very scientific in the old-fashioned sense of the term, objective, physical, and quantifiable. So we should add that. There's nothing dogmatic or kind of, how do you say, eliminative, or there's another word, exclusive. There's nothing exclusive about his approach. Yes, bring in behavior. By way of behavior, you can draw inferential knowledge about the mind. And then even though neuroscience at that time was very, in its very primitive stages, they were beginning. And so by studying the neural correlates of subjective experience, that too may shed some light. So by behavior, inferential. By studying brain correlates, inferential. By practicing introspection, perceptual, direct. Bring these three together, and you have an integrative package. So I thought that made extremely good sense. He proposed this, and he acknowledged too, here quoting him again, introspection is difficult and fallible. So just the fact that you're observing your thoughts, your emotions, desires, motivations, and so on, the fact that you observe it is no guarantee that your observation is valid, right? You can completely misassess or misperceive your own motivations. Does that ever happen? People think, I'm acting out of pure motivation, but make sure you put my name on that building that I've just funded. It's not about me, I just, it's all for everybody, but put my name on it. And people can do that and think, oh, it's pure motivation. Yeah, pure motivation is hard, I think. Pure renunciation, pure bodhicitta, it's hard. And we can easily fool ourselves. We can easily fool ourselves to think we've realized emptiness, or realized rikpa, and so forth and so on. That's in the spiritual category, and everywhere else. Introspection we need to rely upon, but it is difficult, and it's certainly fallible. But then he continues that the difficulty is simply that of all observation of whatever kind. To make rigorous, valid, replicable observations of any sort, it's difficult. The more subtle the phenomenon you're seeking, the more difficult it is. So what to do then? He says the only safeguard is in the final consensus of our farther knowledge about the thing in question, farther being, of course, later, with later views correcting earlier ones until at last the harmony of a consistent system is reached. So it's a purely phenomenological, purely experiential approach, where he's not saying, let's find out what we know to be absolutely true, inherently true, and we'll build on that, which is what Descartes tried to do. He said, no, just jump in and start making some observations and see if there's any consensus, right? And then, so you gain some knowledge, but then you try to inquire more deeply, a sharper critical analysis, maybe sharper ability of observation. And then maybe as you go, and multiple people are doing this, they're collaborating with each other, sharing each other's experiences, then you may discover as you go deeper in your modes of observation and analysis that, oh, we erred at this point. You say, okay, now that was a mistake. And you keep on going with this internal looping to come up with more and more precise, more reliable, more penetrating observations, and you correct earlier mistakes. That has actually described the whole history of modern science. And it's not been stagnant, I think, in any of the fields, but what we see is this wonderful tandem of increasing technology enabling scientists to make sharper, more refined, more rigorous, more sophisticated observations, and then better science and better observations, experimentation, and science. So since Galileo, scientists have been correcting themselves all over the place, but not just going helter-skelter, but coming up with broad bodies of consensual knowledge that has won by centuries of careful observation, experimentation, and then correcting earlier mistakes. So William James is simply suggesting, do like all the other branches of science. But for that, you do need to have some means of refining your ability to probe into the mind. So to sum up this kind of historical brief overview, William James wrote towards the end of his life, At present, psychology is in the condition of physics before Galileo and the laws of motion, of chemistry before Lavoisier and the notion that mass is preserved in all reactions. The Galileo and Lavoisier of psychology will be famous men, or they could be women. Indeed, when they come, as come someday they surely will, or past successes are no index to the future. When they do come, however, the necessities of the case will make them metaphysical. That is, when people gain some real deep insight in the nature of the mind, their discoveries will be deemed by many other people as metaphysical, especially if they don't fit in the materialistic paradigm. Meanwhile, the best way in which we can facilitate their advent is to understand how great is the darkness in which we grope, and never to forget that the natural science, and this one I didn't memorize, so maybe it's lost, but there's no way to collapse this a little bit. Okay. Never forget the natural science. I can't remember the rest of the quote and I don't have it. But it's progressing, something like that. Okay. It's a pretty good ending. Find it for yourself. So now we come back to Asia. And I find it during the time of William James surprising but not astonishing that people like James and Edward Titchener at Cornell University in the United States, who are so keenly interested in the mind, keenly interested in attention and introspection, that they never looked outside of Eurocentric civilization. I mean, not once. They didn't even glance. So William James, for example, wrote brilliantly about attention and how important it is to develop attention skills, the ramifications, the implications, the applications. He was really brilliant. And then he said, but it seems like attention can't be trained. You're either born with good attention or bad. What can you do? Nothing you can do. And that seemed to be the working hypothesis for the whole 20th century. This is the 20th century, where even through the 20th century, let alone the 19th, the wisdom of India, of Southeast Asia, of Tibet, China, Mongolia, shall I go on, Japan, Korea, Cambodia, and so forth, in all of these Asian cultures, every single one that was touched by Buddhism, and virtually all of Asia was, they all received the heritage of samadhi, of tremendous training in mindfulness, of introspection, of vipassana, looking into the mind. We have 5,000 years since the first terracotta images of people sitting in full lotus. You heard about that one, right? So samadhi has been going on for 5,000 years in the Indic cultures. So this is basically a 5,000-year-old history, a culture that's taken a keen interest in the mind and found the appropriate technology for fathoming the mind, the nature of consciousness. And even to this day, I find to an appalling degree, when Western psychologists and neuroscientists come to speak with Buddhists, they do about 90% of the talking. Really, I mean, conference after conference after conference. They're bringing all these Western experts who have no means whatsoever for observing the mind, no training in samadhi, no training in developing intention, no training in introspection. They're talking about the brain and behavior, and they're talking to Buddhists who have 2,500 years of background, and who does all the talking? The people who know or the people who don't know? It's a bit odd. So maybe this will change soon. I keep on pounding the drum and irritating a lot of people. But I do it with a smile. I don't think they really care. But in any case, here we are. Here's some facts. We go back to the tradition of the Shramanas, and it's got to be at least 5,000 years old. Certainly well before the Buddha came along. And these truth seekers, these people who are willing to sacrifice everything, just go out as wandering ascetics, truth seekers, with no church to tell them what they had to believe, right? That's never been the case in India, of conformity, and if you don't conform, we'll have to burn you at the stake. I don't remember Indian governments ever burning anybody at the stake because they believed in God or didn't. And so these were really open-minded people, and a long time ago, and who knows when, some of these earlier truth seekers, these Shramanas, Kuntudoa in Tibetan, they, who knows how long it took them, centuries or millennia, they developed the technology of samadhi. I would say samadhi is to the mind what a telescope is to astronomy. It provides you with that focused attention, like a high-powered telescope, so you can focus on the mind, mental states of consciousness, with continuity, with clarity, and then you can go beyond that. So this samadhi was already very well developed at the time of the Buddha. And then 2,600 years ago, Gautama the Buddha, after going through his 6 years of asceticism, he restored his physical health, and then he commented, after those 6 years and after restoring his health, where could he go now? Because he tried straight samadhi as an end in itself. He tried all manner of ascetic practices and fasting and so forth and so on. Nothing worked, it just damaged his health. And then he recalled, when he was 35 years old, he recalled a spontaneous experience he had when he was a youth, when he just effortlessly slipped into what's called the first jhana, a very fine state of samadhi. He just slipped into it. And he experienced a sense of well-being, of joy. The mind was single-pointed. It was really supple. It was suitable. It was serviceable. And then he slipped out of that and got back to his princely life. But at the age of 35, Gautama recalled that experience as a youth. And the thought arose him. And this is his own narration, not somebody else made up. He thought back to that experience of his youth, and he said, might that, referring to the first jhana, rounded off achievement of shamatha, might that be the way to enlightenment? He just asked himself, and the answer came back intuitively, yes, it is. So he achieved shamatha all over again, which he'd lost in all of ascetic practices. And then he went to the foot of the Bodhi tree, and in pretty short order, achieved enlightenment. What was distinctive about, one of the many distinctive things, about what the Buddha brought to the contemplative culture in India was the use of refining sustained voluntary attention, called that samadhi, with enhanced stability and vividness, so very refined samadhi, and then using that, since the samadhi itself was old history, that was very well-charted territory. All of the jhanas in the form realm, the samapatis, or absorption of the formless realm, all of those have been explored. And Gautama did too. But what he added that was unprecedented was finding, especially this first jhana, where you have the ability to investigate, to analyze. It's called topa and chopa. You can practice vipassana. And he used shamatha, he used the degree of samadhi in unprecedented ways to explore states of consciousness and their objects, and that was vipassana. Vipassana is not simply mindfulness, it's not simply bare attention. These are watered down modern versions, which is fine, but it's not the Buddhist definition. Vipassana always entails inquiry. If there's no inquiry, it's not vipassana. Sorry, but that's just the way it is. Theravada, Mahayana, it doesn't make any difference. Shamatha is simply placing the mind. If all you're doing is bare attention or just being mindful, that's very nice, but that's not vipassana. Not really. This is real. It entails inquiry. There's no difference between Theravada and Mahayana here. So the Buddha then unprecedentedly took his skills of shamatha, that's like the technology, and he combined those with vipassana, and that's the science of open-minded, critical, rational, empirical inquiry. He fused the two, and that was a major, watershed point, or turning point. And then he comments, to summarize this point, the mind that is established in equipoise, that is overcoming the extremes of laxity and excitation, that is balanced, that is in a state of equanimity, comes to know reality as it is, and what he's referring to is exactly the union of shamatha and vipassana. So now what has been discovered? Because nowadays still, as commented by the neuroscientist Donald Hoffman, there's still a mind-body problem. And that is, how does the mind influence or generate the mind? How does the mind possibly influence the brain? One is non-physical, the other one's physical. It's like a ghost in the machine. How does a machine influence a ghost? How does a ghost influence the machine? So it remains a mind-body problem. And I don't see they're making any progress. David Chalmers, with whom I had a kind of a debate or conversation earlier this year, he very famously pointed out that there's the easy problem and the hard problem when it comes to mind. The easy problem, and it's not that easy, but that's finding specific correlations between very specific brain activity and very specific modes of consciousness. Very good science. But then the hard problem is, what's the nature of the correlation? That there are correlations, neuroscientists are doing a great job. But how is it that neurons influence subjective states and vice versa? Do neurons generate consciousness or mental images and memories and so forth? If so, how do they do that? That's the hard problem. And among people who are thoughtful, open-minded, and knowledgeable, I think there's a wide degree of consensus. That remains a mind-body problem, is an unsolved problem. And I'm sure since it's been an unsolved problem in Western philosophy for like 2,500 years, a lot of people probably think it's unsolvable. Some people say it'll never be solved. If we white people, we Eurocentric people, if we haven't solved it, nobody solved it. I was at a conference just last January where a very fine scientist, he's really good, and he commented, we don't know, what was it about mind-body or the nature of consciousness? He said, we don't know what the nature of consciousness is. And I felt, whoa, very humble. And then he said, and he added, nobody does. And I thought, whoa, how pompous. He slipped from humility to pomposity. He slipped from humility to omniscience. Because if you know that nobody knows the nature of consciousness, then you have made a major truth claim. In all the galaxies of the universe, there is no one who knows consciousness. A little bit overboard, don't you think? They're assuming if they don't know, nobody knows. And I kind of get tired of that. Let me tell you about another problem. It's a real mysterious one. You ready? It's called the Earth-planet problem. In the year 1600, this was a doozy. It's a mysterious problem. Do planets go around the Earth? Or do they go around the sun? Ptolemy, who they believed in for 1400 years, said that everything goes around the Earth. Planets, suns, stars, moon, everything goes around the Earth. And that was 1400-year pedigree, had good mathematics behind it. Tycho Brahe, the Danish astronomer, said the sun and the moon go around the Earth, but the planets all go around the sun. And then Copernicus, and following him, Kepler and Galileo said, no. The sun and the moon, the Earth and all the planets go around the sun. So it's the planet-Earth problem. And they just debated back and forth. Some people like this theory, some people like that theory. There was no consensus. And we could still have an Earth-planet problem if nobody developed a telescope. Because these were all very intelligent theories, advocated by very intelligent, knowledgeable people. But it was Galileo who developed the telescope, and he directed his telescope to Venus, and he discovered the phases of Venus, and with that one observation, which took him just a matter of days, he disproved a 1400-year-old belief. Ptolemy is wrong. If Ptolemy is right, Venus could not possibly have phases. The Earth-planet problem was solved by looking carefully at the problems you're seeking to understand, the phenomena you're seeking to understand. Some decades later, further investigation, they found out Tycho Brahe was also wrong. So we're all left with the Copernican system. So nobody talks about an Earth-planet problem, right? Because they found the appropriate technology and they solved it. If you want to know the mind-body problem, you want to solve that problem, how do they interface? It's not enough just look at the body or the brain and not even bother to look at the mind. You will always have a problem. If you have an Earth-planet problem and you never look at the planets, you're going to have an Earth-planet problem forever, right? And you don't just look at them with naked eye, you have to use a telescope, and then there is no Earth-planet problem. And if you develop very rigorous ways of observing the mind, then the mind-body problem vanishes. In fact, in Buddhism, there is no mind-body problem, any more than there's an Earth-planet problem. So let's see about that. So, can I get this going? So there we go. So I'm going to look at 4 dimensions of the mind. And I've got, what do I have? That's not bad. 45 minutes, yeah? Good, until 5. Okay, look at the first one. This is the most familiar one, the psyche. It's what the psychologists study. It's what Buddhists call the coarse mind. The coarse mind arises independent upon, is strongly influenced by the brain, by language, by personal history, by many, many factors, biological, social, psychological, and so on. It's a dualistic mind, and it did not exist, the psyche did not exist before you were conceived, and it will not exist when you die. So it's bracketed between birth and death. That's when the psyche is. You didn't have this psyche before you were conceived, and you won't have this after you're dead. And so it's an embodied mind. It's a mind that is profoundly entangled with physiological processes. It includes both conscious and unconscious mental processes. So Freud's subconscious is definitely within the embodied mind. It's conditioned by the body, influenced in so many ways by the body, and by personal history, physical environment, society, and so on. So that's the mind we're all very familiar with. You say, my mind, that's what you're probably referring to. And it's very important to understand this mind. And the way to understand it, well, it can be studied, as it is studied nowadays by psychologists. It's studied indirectly by interrogation, asking other people about their minds, their desires, thoughts, emotions, and so forth. You give them questionnaires. That's good. Indirectly, you'll learn something, unless the people you're interrogating are delusional or dishonest. So you do this by interrogation, by examination of behavior, facial expressions, body language, and so on. And of course, examination of the brain, this marvelous new science of neuroscience. All of those are indirect, but you can also come to understand the mind, the psyche, the coarse mind, directly through introspection. And that, as William James said, if you follow all of the other sciences, this should be primary, because all the other sciences, Galileo, Lavoisier, Darwin, they all primarily relied upon observation of the phenomena you're seeking to understand. That's scientific. Religious people believe what they're told, philosophers think an awful lot, and scientists look. They believe and think a lot too. But what sets science apart from philosophy and theology is that emphasis on very careful, precise observation and experimentation. That's not happening in modern psychology. Precise observation of the mental states, with hardly any exceptions, even here in India. Hint, hint, India. Even in India, if you look at any of the major universities, show me one where undergraduate students in Psychology 101, are given rigorous training in introspection, training attention skills, mindfulness, and so forth. Where is that? And if it's not there, why on earth not? This is the home of Samadhi, for heaven's sakes. But they were so blown away by British imperialism, they've adopted the myopia of British and American and Eurocentric dogmatism of materialism and snuffed out their own 5,000-year heritage. I would really like to have them invite it back, because it's so far superior. So, in terms of the direct perception of the mind, the empirical investigation of the mind, there's a marvelous, what I would really call, this is just paradigmatic of Buddhist mind science. I've studied it, I've practiced it, I've taught it for decades now. I'd have to say I adore it. It's so profound, and it's the Satipatthana, or the Smritupasthana in Sanskrit, Tempa Nyesha Ji, the 4 close applications of mindfulness. The first one's a good start. You start with the body, because that's the coarsest, easiest to observe. Then you go to feelings, because we care so much about them. Nobody wants to suffer. The third one is the mind. It's the close application of mindfulness to the mind. And if you look at the Satipatthana Sutta, the commentaries, it also occurs in the Prajnaparamita literature. It's in Siksha Samuchaya by Shantideva. I would just say it, I just find it brilliant in terms of truly open-minded, rigorous, rational, careful observation of the mind from a first-person perspective. By the way, the prerequisite for being able to fully engage in such vipassana, because that's what this is a very rigorous training in developing your attention and mindfulness skills, which is done through shamatha. Shamatha is a telescope, this is astronomy of the mind. And so what do you do? If you look at the Satipatthana Sutta, you'll see I'm not making up anything here. What do you do when you're closely applying mindfulness? This means rigorously observing, examining, investigating, real mind science. You're observing or contemplating, as another translation, the processes of origination. How do mental events of all kinds arise? What are the conditions, the triggers, and so forth? Where are they coming from? When they are present, how are they present? Are they permanent, impermanent? Are they satisfying, unsatisfying? Are they really yours? Are they you or not? And then when mental events, mental processes, when they fade away, how do they fade away? And where do they go? Do they go someplace? Origination, abiding, and dissolution, you carefully examine. Scientists are doing this all over the place for all other branches. How does a planet arise? How does it appear? And when, well, this planet, for example, when is it going to come to its demise? That's astronomy, or study of the planet. And then, very pragmatically, because we consider that all of Buddha Dharma is rooted in the Four Noble Truths, from the very beginning through the middle and the end, it's always oriented towards the alleviation of suffering and finding greater happiness, liberation, and awakening. So we never stray far from that, just into egghead speculations or just things for curiosity. Buddhism says, look, life is short. We have an opportunity here to identify what are the true causes of suffering. So these are called klesha. I think the closest translation is mental affliction. And then generically, I mean, there's a wide variety of klesha, or nyumon, mental afflictions, but they all have in common, this is a definition I memorized about 45 years ago, these are all mental processes that have as their function to disrupt the equilibrium of the mind, to disturb the mind, to upset the mind. With craving, that upsets, hatred upsets, delusion upsets, arrogance, jealousy, they all upset the mind, they perturb the mind, they throw the mind into chaos. Mental afflictions do that. And we should bear in mind, mental afflictions sometimes feel really good. When we say mental affliction, doesn't mean they feel bad. When we feel tremendous lust or infatuation with something, it can feel really good, but it's really, really afflicting your mind. And so those are afflictions generically. And so we examine closely which mental states or processes are wholesome, that is constructive, conducive to our well-being and that of others, which are unwholesome. We observe whether mental processes and states are stable or momentary, the 3 marks of existence, true sources of happiness or unsatisfying, personal or impersonal. So these are some of the salient features of the kind of questions being posed in this first-person science of the mind in the Buddhist tradition. As a translator, and I've been translating since about 1972, I'm finding a mistranslation very, very common, so I'm going to beat my drum here a little bit. But many, many people are translating now quite kind of nonchalantly klesha as negative emotions, afflictive emotions, or disturbing emotions. That's just false. Because most of the mental afflictions, the 6 primary afflictions and the 20 derivative ones, most of them are not emotions. And so generically say that afflictions, mental klesha are emotions, negative and so forth, is just terribly misleading. So take just for this is just the 6, among which we only get 4. Whoops. And I don't think I memorized the other 2. Maybe Yeshua can help. But the first one, obvious, avidya. Avidya, for heaven's sakes, ignorance is not an emotion, right? I tell you, it's not. It's cognitive. You're unaware of something. Attachment is not an emotion. Attachment, craving, clinging is not an emotion. It's conative. It's an afflictive, disturbing type of desire. Conative is about desire, aspirations, yearning, goals, ideals, and so forth. It's not emotional. Attachment is not an emotion. Anger is an emotion, that's for sure. But pride, that's not an emotion either. And I know that false view is in there. False views is coming quickly.
Doubt.
What's that?
Doubt.
Doubt, I think that is, yeah. So doubt is cognitive. That's not an emotion. And then false views, that's not an emotion either. And when you look in the 20 derivative ones, there's like distraction and laxity. That's attentional imbalances. Most of them are not emotional. So it would be good to correct that, because when people equate mental afflictions with some kind of emotion, they've knocked out like 3/4 of the afflictions. They won't even notice them. They say, oh, that's not an emotion. I wasn't having a mental affliction. I didn't have any particular emotion at all. That's a big mistake. Sometimes words are important. In terms of mindfulness, we know that mindfulness is really a buzzword. There have been on Time magazine over the last 10, 15 years 2 issues totally devoted to mindfulness. And it's always the modern psychological definition of mindfulness, which many people have found useful, which I'm very happy for. It's this moment-to-moment, non-judgmental awareness. There's no question many people have found it helpful. Many scientific studies of it showing its benefits for reducing stress and so on. As His Holiness commented in 1990 when he was first introduced to this type of mindfulness, he said, he was actually asked, these people that are promoting mindfulness, but without ever referring to Buddhism, what do you think? Is this plagiarism? You know, taking somebody else's goods and then presenting it as your own trademark? And His Holiness' comment was, well, the whole point of Buddhism is to alleviate suffering. And if these people are drawing from Buddhism, giving the Buddha no credit, but really helping people, alleviating suffering, that's good. Yeah, no problem. There's no word for plagiarism in Tibetan. I don't think so. Well, yes, Mate. Maybe a new one. But nowadays, yes, they made many new words. But in old text, plagiarism, in a Kandar, His Holiness said, no problem with plagiarism, but he said, don't mistake this mindfulness for Buddhism. Unfortunately, some of the chief promoters are doing exactly that. They're saying this is Buddhist meditation without the Buddhism. This is Buddhism without the mumbo-jumbo. This is the essence of all of Buddhism, Buddhist meditation. This is the essence of all meditation. And a lot of the media, unfortunately, have gone along for the ride, and they're using mindfulness and meditation interchangeably. So they've dumbed it down to kind of the subterranean level. That's kind of unfortunate, really, because the modern definition of mindfulness has basically nothing to do with the Buddhist definition. Virtually nothing, they hardly even overlap. Here's a classic from Nagasena, an arhat, in a very famous conversation he had with the King Milinda. So, and this is the definition of authentic mindfulness that will help you along the path to liberation and enlightenment. And so, just to quote it briefly, mindfulness, when it arises, it calls to mind wholesome and unwholesome tendencies, with faults and faultless, inferior and refined, dark and pure, together with their counterparts. And that is, these are the concomitant mental processes. Tsumdenki senchung. Mindfulness, when it arises, it follows the courses of beneficial and unbeneficial tendencies. It sees some surge of a mental impulse arising, and then it watches the repercussions. How does this play out? I was feeling really sarcastic the other day, and I made some really clever but very biting sarcastic comment. It felt so good when I said it. And then, how did that play out? How did it affect your mind? How did it affect the other person? Did that turn out well or not? Or feeling contempt for somebody, or jealous, and then you express it. How does it play out? So it's not following a set of commandments. It's not saying God said this or God said that. This is completely pragmatic. See how it impacts your mind. See how your thought processes, your emotions, and so on, how do they influence your mind, other people's minds? Watch it, radically empirically. So mindfulness, when it arises, follows the courses of beneficial and unbeneficial tendencies, and it recognizes these tendencies, upon careful examination, are beneficial, these unbeneficial, these tendencies are helpful, these unhelpful. Thus, one who practices yoga rejects the unbeneficial and embraces or cultivates the beneficial. So that's a real authentic definition of mindfulness. And you see, it has almost nothing to do with the modern definition. This is one that's been useful for 2,000 years. It's a good track record. So the mind that we're all familiar with, the mind that will vanish when we die because it arises independence upon the brain, and in the dying process, when your brain is shutting down, this mind that we identify with very strongly, woman's mind, man's mind, Asian, Western, and so forth, it will dissolve into, it doesn't dissolve into nothing, contrary to the materialistic belief, but it dissolves into a subtler continuum. So this is the Yiganabe Shepe Gyun Tamo, a subtle continuum of mental consciousness. I would propose this as a second dimension of consciousness. And we've not gone into religion here. This is just a bit deeper, and you need better technology than you can say folk psychology, just looking at your mind now and again. Folk psychology is like folk astronomy. That's naked eye stargazing. Oh, isn't the moon beautiful? Oh, there's Jupiter. There's the Pleiades. Oh, that's naked eye. That's folk astronomy. And introspection has been left pretty much at the level of folk psychology in modern science. There have been really no progress since William James of refining in the context of the scientific investigation of the mind, no progress in terms of developing attention skills, mindfulness, introspection, or samadhi. But if you do develop those, then you discover another dimension of consciousness. It's the semthamo, subtle mind, or subtle continuum. It is indeed a subtle dimension of consciousness which is accessed. You slip into it, but probably unconsciously. In deep sleep, when you become comatose, when you faint, general anesthesia, but also at death. If you've studied the dying process, you know the last phase before the clear light of death is this dark near attainment. That's when your coarse mind has dissolved, and irreversibly, into a subtler continuum. And most people, when they arrive there, they just black out. So they are not explicitly aware of anything, very much as if you were in deep, dreamless sleep. But this dimension of consciousness can be accessed lucidly, knowingly, with a wide-awake mind if you achieve shamatha. You're accessing the same dimension. This subtle continuum, this is the ground state of the psyche. That is, from lifetime to lifetime, coarse minds arise independence upon, let's say for animals and human beings, arises independence upon the brain of a turtle, an ant, a human being, grasshopper. And so your subtle continuum is configured by the nervous system and the brain of the body that's forming as your body forms in the next life or this life. And so the continuum of consciousness that carries from lifetime is like a stem consciousness, as we have a stem cell that can be, by its environment, be configured as a neuron, a brain cell, as a liver cell, bone marrow cell, and so forth, but itself hasn't yet been configured. The subtle continuum of mental consciousness as such, when it's just come to rest, is the ground state of the psyche. In the Theravada tradition, it's called the bhavanga, and is that from which all mental activities emerge and into which they dissolve from life to life. Now this could easily be presented as, well, this is my philosophy or my religious belief, but for the real adepts, not just philosophers or religious believers within Buddhism, this is a hypothesis that has been tested thousands of times for hundreds of years. It's sometimes called the alaya vijnana. And I know I'm just stepping onto kind of fragile ice here, because I know perfectly well the prasangika madhyamaka, at least in the interpretation of Tsongkhapa, says there is no such thing. The whole Yogacara notion of the alaya vijnana, storehouse consciousness, all foundation consciousness, doesn't exist at all, and he gives very compelling reasons for refuting it. However, Nagarjuna, and I'm going to come back to Tsongkhapa, Nagarjuna, in his Bodhicitta, in his commentary on Bodhicitta, the Bodhicitta Vivarana, about which I heard His Holiness's oral commentary about a year ago in Strasbourg, and His Holiness quoted this verse right towards the beginning of the text, and unfortunately we don't quite have the end of it. Here's Nagarjuna straight. When iron approaches a magnet, it quickly spins into place. Although it has no mind, it appears as though it did. So iron filings, it could look like they're attracted to the magnet. Oh, look at them run, you know. Look at them move. They must like the magnet. It appears as if they have a mind, but they don't. In the same way, the substrate consciousness, that's my translation of the Kunzhi Namshe, or Alai Vijnana, has no true existence. So right immediately, he refutes Chittamatra. Because Chittamatra, of course, the Yogacara Chittamatra does assert the existence of the Alaya Vijnana, a storehouse consciousness, a repository of all karmic imprints, but of course they insist that it is inherently existent. Nagarjuna says, no, it's not. It's as empty of inherent nature as anything else, but he's not refuting it entirely. He's simply saying it has no true existence. Yet, so although it has no true existence, yet when it comes from a previous life and goes to the next, it moves just as though it were real. It moves as if it were inherently existent, but it isn't. And so it takes hold of one lifetime in succession after another, something like that. He ends quickly there. So Tsongkhapa wrote a commentary to this text. And he comments here, because he's saying Nagarjuna is affirming the existence of substrate consciousness, although he's refuting its true existence. And he says here, Tsongkhapa says that when Nagarjuna affirms here the Alaya Vijnana, what he's referring to is nothing other than the subtle continuum of mental consciousness. No frills, no addition, no Chittamatra, just that. It's just another name for the same thing that is nowhere refuted in any of the four schools of Buddhism. So I think we can relax around the term Alaya Vijnana. And actually, just as a side note, in the Sakya tradition, Sakya Pandita, and other great adepts of the Sakya tradition, who are very, very firm advocates of Prasangika Madhyamaka, they do affirm the existence of the substrate consciousness, the Alaya Vijnana. They simply say, yeah, but of course it doesn't inherently exist. So they're not Chittamatra. They're throwing that out. And they simply say, we're going to use this word. Let's not make a big deal of it. It's simply the subtle continuum mental consciousness that carries on from lifetime to lifetime. And some people call it the substrate consciousness. We shouldn't get upset at that. There's a text that I've translated. It was one of the most challenging translations I've done, about 20 books or so that I've translated. This is a book that I hold in awe, really deep reverence. It's actually, this is a text, about a 400-page text, that is written down by the great 19th century Nyingma Dzogchen adept, Dujum Lingpa. And he received these teachings by way of pure vision, Daknang it's called. It's actually very common in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, and before that India. Tsongkhapa, for example, had a number of pure visions from Manjushri, in which he received teachings from Manjushri, and then he wrote them down. Tsongkhapa was the scribe, and the teacher was Manjushri. Sachen Kungin Nyingbo also had visions of Manjushri and many others, visions of Vajrapani and so forth. So this was not really unusual. Dujum Lingpa, being an extraordinary individual, tremendous realization, he had a vision of a manifestation of Padmasambhava, called in Tibetan Soke Dorje, or the Lake Born Vajra. So these are the words of Padmasambhava as they were received in a pure vision by Dujum Lingpa and written down. He had the vision around 150 years ago. The quote is a bit long, but I think you may find it very relevant here. So he's talking about shamatha and coming to the culminating phase of shamatha where your mind dissolves into this subtle continuum that in Dzogchen is also called the substrate consciousness, but in accordance with Prasangika, not Chittamatra, because they specifically refute its inherent existence. And so Padmasambhava states here, the rope of mindfulness and firmly maintained attention is dissolved by the power of meditative experience. As you're proceeding along those 9 stages of shamatha, many experiences will arise, and as they arise, if you know how to deal with them skillfully, then they purify the obscurations, the distortions, the afflictions of the mind. And so the mindfulness and attention, the power of that is like the rope of that, the connection between your awareness and the object of awareness is dissolved until finally the ordinary mind of an ordinary being disappears, as it were. This is your psyche. This is the coarse mind that arises independent upon the brain. It disappears, as it were. And once your mind, with all of its thoughts and rumination, dualistic grasping and so forth, once that subsides, it dissolves. Consequently, compulsive thinking, it's called namdok in Tibetan, subsides and roving thoughts vanish into the space of awareness. You then slip into the vacuity of the substrate, the alaya or kunzhi, which is just a space, it's just a vacuous space. You slip into the vacuity of the substrate, the vacuous space of awareness itself, in which self, others, and objects disappear. It's an appearance-free space, devoid of appearances and objects. by adhering to the experience of vacuity and luminosity while looking inwards, because you've completely inverted your awareness away from all the five physical senses, the appearances of self, others, and objects vanish. This is the substrate consciousness. This is the subtle continuum of mental consciousness. It's the alaya vijnana. Some teachers say that the substrate to which you descend is freedom from conceptual elaboration. This is the second of the 4 yogas in Mahamudra. It's a very advanced state of realization and taking vipassana, realization of emptiness. So they're taking something that's just an awareness of vacuity and then saying, oh, this is some realization of emptiness, high realization in Mahamudra. Or they think even beyond that it's one taste, which is even a higher degree of realization in Mahamudra. So they're completely conflating it. But others say it is ethically neutral, lumate. But whatever they call it, in truth, you've come to the essential nature of the mind. The essential nature of mind is very clear by context. He's not referring to the emptiness of inherent nature of the mind, but simply its fundamental salient features. In Buddhist psychology, the definition of consciousness is selching rikpa. It's luminous and cognizant. So you've come to unconfigured consciousness. This is not male, female, it's not human or deva or preta. It's just kind of stem consciousness, stripped clean of all the elaborations, configurations, influenced by brain, society, and so forth. Just naked, simple flow of consciousness, but it's not rikpa, it's not transcendent, it's not ultimate, it's just the essential nature of your mind. Bare bones, naked awareness. So that's a pretty clear definition. It's entirely experiential, there's no philosophy here. But now in a similar vein, here's a man who is one of the greatest scholars in the Gelugpa tradition, as well as a great adept, the root lama of the 5th Dalai Lama, Panchen Losar Chukyi Gyaltsen. He must be, I think, the most famous of all the Panchen lamas. And again, we're missing the last line, unfortunately. So he writes here in his root text and commentary to his text on Mahamudra, according to the union of the Gelu and Kanji traditions. He writes here in this discussion of shamatha, in this context where you're focusing single-pointedly on the mind. He writes here, the nature of meditative equipoise, nyamsha, is not obscured by anything. That is, when you're simply resting in the nature of the mind, you're coming to this subtle dimension. But it is lucid and clear, not established as anything physical. When you come to the very core nature, the essential nature of awareness, of consciousness, it has no physical attributes whatsoever. It's not established as anything physical. It is a clear vacuity like space. Allowing anything to arise, it is vividly awake. Such is the nature of the mind. This is superbly witnessed with direct perception, simply through samatha. I'm not even talking about vipassana. Yet it cannot be grasped as this, or demonstrated with words. And that is, if you're talking with somebody else who is conscious, then you don't have to speak many words. You can say, being conscious? They said, yeah. But if you had a conversation, I don't have my cell phone's in my jola. If you brought out your cell phone and you try to have a conversation with Siri, trying to explain to Siri, I'm going to explain consciousness to you, Siri. You're going to have a very short conversation. I've asked her, are you conscious? She basically blows me off or sends me to a website. She's very coy and very adroit at dodging the question. If you're talking to a computer, there are no words you can use to convey to the computer what it's like to be conscious, what it is to know. Robots, artificial intelligence, computers don't have a clue. And there's no words. If you're talking to a zombie or somebody who is simply, hypothetical person like a zombie who is unconscious, you cannot convey to them with words at all. And so it's inexpressible to a person who doesn't already know. And if you already know, you don't have to say much. And so it can't be demonstrated with words. And now here's an aphorism: whatever arises, rest loosely without grasping. It's a phrase from Tibetan. And Panchen Rinpoche comments, now for the most part, contemplatives of Tibet uniformly proclaim this as practical advice for achieving enlightenment. So this is dumbed down Mahamudra, dumbed down Dzogchen, dumbed down Vipassana, where all you have to do is, whatever comes up, just rest loosely, don't grasp. Just be here now. Even Tibetans did that. I think there must have been Tibetan hippies, because I thought this was California. Like, be here now, dude. Pass the joint. Yeah. I don't think they're passing the joint in Tibet, but even in Tibet, they're people too. They'll dumb down all of Mahamudra, all of Dzogchen, and just be here now. And so some people think that's all you need. Just be here now, just rest and bear awareness, choiceless awareness, and that'll take you all the way to enlightenment. So that's a little bit of superstition. However, I, Chukyi Gyaltsen, declare this to be an exceptionally skillful means for novices to achieve mental stillness and ascertain the relative nature of the mind. I memorized that one, at least very closely. He is saying exactly what Padmasambhava stated by way of Dujum Lingpa. This practice, which is a shamatha practice, you simply focus on the mind until your mind dissolves into the subtle mind. This is a superb method for actually ascertaining the nature of consciousness. You're knowing it directly. Like when you eat chocolate, there's nothing mysterious about the taste of chocolate. You got it. You may not know it chemistry, but you know the taste of chocolate, right? And you get to this point where you've melted your mind down, you simplified it to its core, just that sheer luminosity and clarity, that luminosity and cognizance. And that's it. You have discovered the nature of consciousness directly by looking in the right direction. With refined attention, very careful samadhi, there is no mystery of consciousness in Buddhism. There's a mystery of consciousness all over the West. Oh, what is it? Oi, oi, so mysterious, must have made. I remember speaking with a friend of mine, a very dear man, he's a neuroscientist, and he told me, Alan, consciousness is such a mystery. And I'm just polite, he's a sweet guy, but I didn't have to say, bollocks! What a load of crap! Do you only live in California? You've been to India, did you not listen? The Hindus have a lot of insight into consciousness. Theravada Buddhists, Mahayana Buddhists, Vajrayana Buddhists, Dzogchen. There's no mystery about consciousness at all. You're just not listening. You're talking too much, and you're looking in the wrong direction. There's a famous analogy of a fellow who loses his keys. You may have heard it. It's quoted by John Searle, a very famous philosopher. The fellow's lost his keys at night, and he's groping around under a street light, and some fellow comes over and says, you lose something here? And the guy says, yeah, I lost my keys. And the fellow said, you did lose it here? He said, no, I lost it over there in the dark. He said, what are you looking here for? This is where the light is. And so what scientists are very good at, where the light is, and I say this with respect, no sarcasm, where the light is, they're brilliant at illuminating the nature of objective, physical, and quantifiable phenomena. They're fantastic. That's why it's worthwhile for monks here at the library and elsewhere to be studying biology and physics and chemistry and neuroscience, because the West is really good at it. They're good at looking outwards. But if you keep on looking outwards at the brain and behavior and trying to understand consciousness, it's like looking due west and wondering, when's the sun going to rise? You'll be the last one to know. Because you're looking where the light is, but not where you dropped your keys. And you drop your keys it's inside. It shouldn't be really that mysterious, but they still haven't caught on. I would love to see a Buddhism science conference where just to balance things out a little bit, 90% of the talking is done by Buddhists who actually know what they're talking about when it comes to consciousness. We Buddhists don't know a lot of things about that the scientists do know. But when it comes to consciousness, maybe the Westerners should be listening and not talking so much. So, that's an opinion. Nobody has to agree with me, but it's a strongly held opinion. Develop shamatha, and you can really fathom the nature of consciousness. And it's remarkable, and a lot of benefits in achieving shamatha. If you develop both shamatha and vipassana, and you unify the two, this critical inquiry, the investigation of vipassana, then another type of perception arises, nanjoki munsum, or yogic perception. And this arises by relying on its dominant cause. What is the deal maker for bringing forth yogic perception? It's the union of shamatha and vipassana. Bringing these two together results in a wide variety of modes of perception that are just shunned like leprosy by mainstream. I know this because I work with psychologists and neuroscientists a lot. But if you raise things like paranormal, parapsychology, remote viewing, precognition, clairvoyance, and so forth, they just break into hives. They just run the opposite direction. If you cite any of the 40 years of research on reincarnation done at the University of Virginia, they just run for the hills. They won't even critique it. I asked the fellow who's in charge of research, it's now 40 years of research, on enormous amount of data of investigating children who allegedly have past life recall. 40 years of research. And I asked him, his name is Jim Tucker, I asked him about a year ago, Jim, it was first Ian Stevenson, he passed away, and I wrote to him, Jim, how many open-minded, critical reviews have you have been published by scientists, published in peer-reviewed journals, of your research on evidence of children recalling past lives? None. 40 years, they haven't even looked. So that's worse than refuting. If their research is shabby, then show how shabby it is. Then they can improve. But the worst criticism you can give is to ignore entirely. Because, you remember the hierarchy? If reincarnation is true, that blows the smithereens out of the notion that everything is just physical. And then you have to fundamentally reassess your worldview from the bottom up. So, Wolfsinger, one of the finest neuroscientists in all of Europe, German, good friend with my dear friend, Mathieu Ricard. The two of them, this world-class neuroscientist, Mathieu Ricard, an outstanding monk, they were visiting, I think, some hermitage up in the Himalayas. I think it was the monastery of Tushik Rinpoche. And so Mathieu was serving as interpreter. They were speaking with one yogi after another who had either experienced some extraordinary abilities or witnessed them, and they were telling story after story, you know, of the paranormal abilities, extrasensory perception, that came out of really intensive long-term retreat. And Wolfsinger, bless his heart, I don't know him well, I've met him, but he turned to Mathieu told me this, and when they had the conversation, he heard all these stories that completely blow away scientific materialism. And Wolfsinger, who is a scientific materialist, he turned to Mathieu and said, if they're right, we're completely wrong. I respect that kind of candor and you know, honesty. So when you achieve this yogic perception, it results in a wide variety of modes of extrasensory perception, including remote viewing, knowing others' minds, clairaudience, recollection of past lives. And in Buddhist texts, they'll give you basically the strategies, exactly how you develop these. These are not supernatural. A laser is paranormal light. If you could get in a time machine and take a laser, or even a cell phone, back to 1900, and showed what you could do with a laser, people would say, God, it's supernatural. It's amazing. It's mystical. This is not natural. It's not. If you don't, I think it was Arthur C. Clarke, the science fiction writer, said, any degree of technology sufficiently high developed, when not understood, is seen as magic. But nobody now thinks lasers are magic because we know the technology behind it. This is technology. This is not magic, it's not voodoo, it's not religious belief, it's not superstition. Do the hard work, and this is what comes out of it. It's hard work, though. You should have no qualms about that. In terms of discovery of past lives, some people, so-called secular Buddhists, they're trying to blow this one off as if the Buddha hiccuped. He didn't really mean it, ah, shucks. That's bollocks. He absolutely meant it. He declared that it was his direct perception. So nobody has to believe that. But if people call themselves the Buddhists, and then blow away what the Buddha said, well, never mind reincarnation, karma, and so forth, I think they're fooling themselves. It's like saying, I'm a Freudian, but I don't believe in the subconscious, or the id, or the ego, or libido, or death wish. But I'm a Freudian. I'll just make up my own Freudianism. It'll be neo-Freudianism. It's basically Alan Wallaceism. But it's better marketing if I call it Freud, because nobody knows who Alan Wallace is, but Freud, a lot of people know. So I think for marketing reasons, people who are really not Buddhists at all will use the word Buddhism just to, marketing purposes and call it secular. This is what the Buddha said. Direct quote, when my concentrated mind, he developed the technology of jhana, shamatha at least, first jhana, fourth jhana, when my concentrated mind was thus purified, bright, unblemished, and rid of imperfection. That's the work of shamatha, to do that. When it had become malleable, that's lesurungwa, wieldy, that's shinjang. Lesurungwa is surfaceable, shinjang is pliant, buoyant, malleable, steady, and attained to imperturbability, miyoa, that's shamatha. Then he applied vipassana. I inclined my mind to the knowledge of recollection of past lives. He took, having achieved shamatha, slipped into that subtle continuum, then directed his attention like a laser pointer to the past, and he revealed, as he said, he revealed thousands of previous lives. He said, I saw with direct knowledge. He narrated how he recollected the specific circumstances of many thousands of his own former lives over the course of many ages, of world contraction and expansion. And this is billions of years, so it looks an awful lot like Big Bang followed by Big Crunch. Really, that's what it is. Contraction is Big Crunch and expansion is out from Big Bang. And this is the Buddha talking in the Pali Canon. I don't think it's a coincidence. And this was the first watch of the night. He said, this was my first true knowledge during the first watch of the night. attained by me in the first watch of the night. Ignorance was banished, true knowledge arose, darkness was banished, and light arose, as it happens in one who is something, but I'm not quite sure what, because the slide runs out. But he states very clearly, this is not something, as really ridiculous speculation suggests, that the Buddha just picked up reincarnation because a lot of people believed it, and he thought it would be good for people to believe, it'd make it more ethical. This is utterly juvenile. It makes the Buddha look like an idiot. That, well, we have to make people be good, so let's just tell them reincarnation. Of course, it's not true, but a lot of people believe it, so why don't we go along with it? He looked like, frankly, an idiot. If he did that, I'd have no faith in him at all. You're like the village moron. But that was complete nonsense. He's like many Hindu adepts before him. This was ancient knowledge. This was knowledge, but 1,000, 2,000 years or longer before. People would achieve very profound samadhi. You can access past life. This has been affirmed by Hindu contemplatives long before the Buddha, by Buddhists, of course, by Taoists. Reincarnation is very central in Taoism. There are many Sufis that affirm this in the Muslim tradition. Early Christians, until it was outlawed, early Christians, the death of fathers, many believe in reincarnation. In the Kabbalah, the Jewish mysticism, front and central. So this is not just an Eastern deal. This is something wherever you find contemplatives who achieve very deep samadhi, this just comes up. You start recalling things from past lives. Because all your memories are not stored in the brain. There's no evidence they are. The brain's more like the keyboard. The hard drive is this subtle continuum of consciousness. And that you can access just with shamatha. When you tap into that dimension of the mind, then it becomes quite apparent that among body, speech, and mind is really primary. Because when you die, your body, of course, just molders in the grave, turns into fertilizer, your speech just vanishes. And the mind carries on and then adopts a new body, and with that body has speech again. So you see the primacy, you see through your own experience that the mind is primary, and one could easily draw the conclusion, aha, all there are is appearances to the mind, like the Chittamatrans affirmed, but it's really mind only. The only thing that's really absolutely real, truly existent, is consciousness or mind. One could easily draw that conclusion. But now in the same text, the Vajra essence, which is straight Dzogchen and completely in accordance with Prasangika Madhyamaka, I've had 20 years to study, reflect upon, and practice this text, then the emptiness of inherent nature of that mind is clearly articulated. So here it is, rather long quote, hopefully worth your while. Yeah, we have a bit of time still. So third dimension, there are only going to be 4. So here's Dujum Lingpa again, it's the Vajra essence. By examining whether the mind, that is the all-creating sovereign, that is from which all appearances manifest, is the one that's in charge, it's the primary among body, speech, and mind, that is the all-creating sovereign of the body, speech, and mind, examining whether it is really existent or really non-existent. When examining this is with vipassana now, not just shamatha. But examining with this vipassana, the mind is found to have no basis or root. It is not established as having any shape or color. If you're looking for its inherent qualities as it exists from its own side, they're not to be found. The 5 elements and the 5 sensory objects appear like objects of the mind, and your own body appears as its base. But if all these are investigated from the ultimate perspective, this is Dundambe Chepa, the ontological investigation, really probing into the nature of existence of the mind, then all of these, the sensory objects, the brain, the mind, the 5 elements, and consciousness itself, the mind itself, they are found to be like space, not truly established as either one thing or many. They're not inherently one or many. Ascertaining, and this is really the core of Vipassana in the Mahamudra and Dzogchen traditions, ascertaining the origin, location, and destination of the mind as objectless openness is the spontaneous actualization of the essential nature of the path of cutting through. That's cutting through to the conditioned mind to pristine awareness, or Rigpa. This is not something freshly achieved, but is simply the knowledge of the mode of being, of the nature of existence. So he's going beyond the conventional nature of mind to its ultimate nature, and finding the mind itself, consciousness itself, does not exist by its own characteristics. It's not truly existent, does not have its own inherent nature. Neither its origin, nor its location, nor its destination, or its own nature exist inherently. The mind is empty of inherent nature. Its nature is shunya. And that is the emptiness of the mind, completely in accordance with Nagarjuna and the Prasangika interpretation of the middle way view. So that's 3. This is still all nature of mind. So just pausing for a moment, the whole theme of nature of mind is very, very popular nowadays, especially in Tibetan Buddhism, and many fine and sometimes not so qualified teachers are giving workshops, lectures, retreats, and so forth on this theme. And sometimes it's a bit vague. I've heard a number of talks where the person is speaking with great enthusiasm about nature of mind, and after a while you kind of wonder, exactly what are you referring to? Is there only one nature of mind? And in this short presentation here, it becomes obvious, no, the word nature of mind can apply to 4 whole dimensions, which are very different. One is the nature of your mind, which mental afflictions are dominant, which mental properties and so forth, your mind, male mind, female mind, and so forth, that's nature of mind. How do mental afflictions arise and so on, that's nature of mind. If you dissolve your mind into this underlying continuum and realize its sheer luminosity, its sheer cognizance, and the qualities of, it's called Tibetan, desem itokpa, bliss, luminosity, and non-conceptuality, that you fathom, that you experience when you achieve shamatha, and realize the essential nature of mind, that's nature of mind. It's not the same as the coarse mind, subtle mind. Then do an ontological analysis of that, and you realize the emptiness of mind. It's ultimately empty nature, that's nature of mind. That's already 3, and they're not overlapping. They're distinct. And there's still a 4th one. The karasa, yuksem karasa, yuksem yuksem. So yuksem is indwelling mind, and usel is clear light. This is the kind of the point, especially explicitly, of stage of completion practice. It is, according to His Holiness Dalai Lama, this innate indwelling mind of clear light is the same as Rigpa, pristine awareness. It's the same as Yeshe, primordial consciousness. And in the Dzogchen traditions, this is the same as Dharmakaya, same as Tathagarbha, Buddha nature. So it is a 4th dimension. This is not your coarse mind, it's not subtle mind, it's not the emptiness of the mind, it's another dimension. It is the ultimate luminous, empty ground state of consciousness pervading all phenomena. So it's called jnana or yeshe in Tibetan, primordial consciousness. And this is non-dual from the non-local, atemporal, absolute space of phenomena, or dharmadhatu, which is emptiness. And it's also non-dual from the energy of primordial consciousness, or yeshike lung. So you have the dharmadhatu, ultimate reality of emptiness. You have dharmakaya, ultimate consciousness. And you have the consciousness, the energy, yeshike lung, the energy of primordial consciousness. And that those 3 are completely indivisible. This is the 4th dimension. This is the point, explicitly the point, of stage of completion, practice of Mahamudra and Dzogchen. And so in Dzogchen, this is commonly referred to as Rigpa, or pristine awareness. And so pristine awareness is realized by recognizing that things appear even though nothing exists from the side of appearances. So that's their shunya nature. And that all appearances of the physical worlds and their sentient inhabitants have no existence apart from the ground Sugatagarbha, which is Buddha nature, which is Rigpa, while those appearances are of the same nature as the displays or effulgences of the ground Sugatagarbha. Rigpetel, effulgences, creative displays of Rigpa. So that's how reality looks when you're viewing it from the perspective of Rigpa. And Padmasambhava here, I think this is from the same text, the Vajra Essence, incomplete quote, pristine awareness awakens within itself, and due to your eye of primordial consciousness, penetrating wisdom, you perceive all appearing phenomena of samsara and nirvana with unobscured extrasensory perception, like the bright reflections of planets and stars in a clear pool of water, something like that. So this is ontological in the sense of viewing from the perspective of Rigpa. You are perceiving all phenomena to be empty of inherent nature. That's ontological. You're seeing their ultimate mode of existence. But it's phenomenological in the sense that you're also seeing them in the same moment as pure displays. It's called taknyam, equally pure displays. The whole of samsara and nirvana, equally pure displays of pristine awareness. We've definitely gone into a 4th dimension here. This is said to be, when you're dwelling in Rigpa, it's said that you're in the 4th time, not in the past, present, or future, but in a dimension of time that transcends and permeates the 3 times. And then from the Buddha himself, just addressing how much can we know? What can be known as we proceed along a path of ever-increasing awareness, of mindfulness, of clarity? And two quotes from the Buddha himself, Pali Canon. The Buddha is describing his own wisdom here. And he says, whatever in this world with its deities is to be seen, heard, sensed, and cognized, or reached, sought out, and encompassed by the mind, that I know, that I have directly known. It's an extraordinary statement, that all that can be known, he says, I know, that his awareness is unimpeded, and this is in the Pali Canon. So this is phenomenological, that is, so you not only have come to know the nature of existence, the neluk of all phenomena, their ultimate mode of existence, but it's called in Tibetan Jinye Zikbe Yeshe, the primordial consciousness that sees the full range of phenomena. And the primordial consciousness that knows the nature of existence is Jitawa Kembe Yeshe, and that is primordial consciousness that knows how phenomena exist, the manner of existence. So one is ontological, the other one's phenomenological. And in a very famous quote from the Buddha, he states, it is in this fathom-long carcass, this body, with its perceptions and its mind that I describe the world, the origin of the world, the cessation of the world, and the way that something like it leads to nirvana. Something like that. I'm dribbling off again and again because, what's that?
Leading to the cessation of the world.
And the way? Leading to the cessation, oh, very good. That's almost clairvoyance. But you're absolutely right. And the way leading to the cessation of the world. Exactly right. Good. That's about 1/5 of the letter, and she picked it up. Bravo. So, to sum up then, it appears to me that where we are, this era in the history of humanity, I think it's quite obvious it's unprecedented. We've never been here before. And in some ways catastrophic. Global warming, the decimation of the environment, the wiping out of species, the spoiling of the ocean, the spoiling of the air. I don't need to go on. We've never done this. What's happened in the last 40 years is the largest die-off of species on the planet for the last 65 million years. It was when the meteor hit. There was destruction like what we're doing in the last 40 years, or last 150 years. I mean, we are a meteor, modern human materialistic society that's gobbling up this earth like it's an orange, and then hoping that we can all go interstellar like the movie, and after we've completely ground this to a pulp, then the super rich ones will pop off in a spaceship and find another planet to defile. And all the rest of us will just kind of rot in the hell we've created for ourselves. And so I didn't really enjoy that movie much. It seemed like it was only good for the exceptionally rich. You know that 3 people in the United States own as much as the poor half of the whole population? 3 people, Jeff Bezos and Warren Buffett, and of course Bill Gates. They own as much as the poor half of the US population. And 8 people on the planet own as much as the poor half of the human population. 8 people own as much as 3.75 billion people. This is not sustainable, this is catastrophic, and we're not slowing it down right now. So yes, this is unprecedented. This has never happened before. And so, but it's also unprecedented in remarkable and wonderful ways. And we clearly need major, major responses to the major catastrophes that are human-made. As His Holiness was asked, I think, about the catastrophe going on in Syria. You know, he was asked, should we pray to God? Should we pray for peace in Syria? And I'm paraphrasing his response. He said, look, God didn't create that mess, so don't ask him to clean it up. We created the mess, so we have to figure out how to clean it up. God can applaud us when we're finished. He didn't quite say that, but the gist of it he did say. What we've created for the planet is not natural catastrophes. It's not God, angels, or devils. We did it, and we have to get our act together quickly, or we really will destroy our planet. And so we need exceptional methods, and I think Buddhism offers some extremely important contributions to the possibility of healing the planet and leaving it for our children and grandchildren and so forth, leaving them a world they would actually be happy to live in. So claims of exceptional ways of knowing, which we've just seen, these 4 dimensions of consciousness, almost all of which are unknown to modern science. These call for research involving sophisticated, sustained training in first-person contemplative methods to complement third-person scientific methods. But this is not combat, this is not a contest, it's not winners and losers. The scientists have a marvelous array of very sophisticated systems of observation that are third person, and Buddhism for 2,500 years has a marvelous array of first person. Bring them together in a spirit of mutual respect and integration, rather than the scientists dominating all the conversations and simply studying the brains and behavior of meditators, treating them like, chimpanzees or rats. That's what's pretty much happened now. They're very polite. They treat their rats nicely. But still, the meditators are just subjects for the scientific experiments. And they're writing all the papers. So I'm kind of tired of that. I'd like to see more, parity. And so this would be coming together in mutual respect. And really respect. And not acknowledging the limitations of our respective fields, but also respecting the strengths of the other. Such research should examine the broadest possible range of states of consciousness, yogic perception, precognition. Look at the whole range, don't just focus on normal people and psychopaths. And be conducted by skeptical, rigorous, open-minded psychologists, neuroscientists, physicists, philosophers, and contemplatives. And what I've been proposing for some years now, we need not one but a network of centers for contemplative research that should be created for training professional contemplatives, especially in shamatha and vipassana, in collaborative research with scientists and philosophers. I think that really holds the key, a key, something contributing to help heal the planet and save our own species together with all the other species on the planet. So that's about it. That's a brief introduction to Buddhist Science of the Mind. So I was trained in debate decades ago. You want to debate? I'm happy to debate. Questions or comments, insights, anything coming up? I'm happy to listen to you now. What's up? Yes, please.
As you pointed out, part of our mind is not reducible to the brain,
Quite so.
matter.
Yes.
So my question for physicists is, why do we thought about how you can mentally control the physical world, the material world? Because if it's true, and I believe it's true,
Yeah.
then the mind has to control the brain. And the mind has to interact with the matter that the brain consists of. So,
Right.
And then in a way we have to show scientifically that you can interfere with matter, like in Princeton, experiments in Princeton has been done.
Yes, I know of that, yeah.
And I think Dean Radin did this, yes.
Dean Radin, sure, the ions, sure, I know him, sure.
Exactly. So if we can't prove that the mind can influence mentally matter, nobody will pick it up.
Yeah, you're quite right. You're quite right. And so, in physics, we have non-relativistic physics and then relativistic physics, right? And that is, until you start moving near the speed of light, everything looks very Newtonian, right? Newton reigns. But get up to 9/10 of the speed of light, and then it's just not Newtonian anymore. And what we'd have in modern psychology, neuroscience, the mind sciences, I would call non-relativistic mind science. Not pejorative. But they're studying ordinary people and people who are subnormal, almost invariably. And if they ever study exceptional people, like yogis who've meditated for 40,000 hours, what do? They study their brains and write a paper about their brains. But they don't ask them, did you discover anything? That's the question I'm waiting for them to ask. You don't ask a chimpanzee what he discovered. You don't ask a rat what it discovered. But if you're dealing with a meditator who's meditated for 40,000 hours, you might want to ask him whether he discovered anything. That hasn't happened yet. And so maybe it's high time, But it's not enough also for, let's say, modern scientists, because they're not just Western, they're outstanding Indian neuroscientists, Singaporean and so forth, that has nothing to do with the West anymore because it's gone global. But what we've had thus far in the meetings between scientists and Buddhists, by and large, with hardly any exceptions, is the scientists time and again are reporting on their latest research. Very good research. And we found this last week, we found this last month. We discovered this, and they're reporting to the Buddhists, and then what do the Buddhists do? Well, according to Nagarjuna, or Tsongkhapa said, or this Lama said, or a century ago, there was this yogi who could display, we're telling them stories. We're telling them philosophy. We're citing great adepts from the past. What we're not doing is telling them the latest reports from our contemplative research facilities, where we have 50 people here, or 50 nuns and 50 monks practicing full-time. They've achieved shamatha. They're remembering past lives. They're starting to develop siddhis. Why aren't we doing that? All of the methods are there, and it's not happening. And so what we have with the groups like at the University of Virginia, with hundreds of children they've examined, but they're all ordinary kids. And so they're not controlled experiments. And Dean Radin, I know him, I admire him, I know the people there at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. These are people who just happen to have psychic abilities. I know another fellow who's one of the leaders in the field of studying remote viewing and precognition. But there's no rigorous training. So if somebody comes and this person displays, and then they write about it, but it's very unpersuasive to people who are really not open-minded. And so what Buddhism has to offer here is not just finding children who randomly seem to remember past lives, or people who have psychic abilities and healing abilities, but rather train people who don't have any of those abilities. Normal people, but who are very dedicated to Dharma, they're intelligent, they're ethical, highly motivated, and spend as long as you need. It takes 8 years to get a PhD in neuroscience, or something like that, right? So why don't we have research facilities where it takes 8 years of rigorous 10, 12-hour-a-day training? Shamatha Vipassana should be core, and then all the sources, Theravada, Mahayana, Vajrayana, they all say develop shamatha, and you start being able to recall past lives and abilities to influence mind with matter. But what we don't have right now, and I'm just kind of pounding the drum, as a Westerner, pounding the Buddhist drum, encouraging, Buddhists, including Asian Buddhists, we're missing something here. We don't have here in India or in the West anywhere contemplative research centers where people are spending 5, 10, 15 years in rigorous training to fully achieve shamatha. And on that basis, achieve vipassana. On that basis, then, maybe through Vajrayana or maybe just with shamatha vipassana, develop these abilities. But now what would be really wonderful, and we're now planning to do this in Italy. We found the land, we're getting very close to getting all the permits needed, then it's fundraising, hopefully by 2019, we're going to have a contemplative research facility going with 20 to 30 cabins of professionally trained contemplatives. And that will be shamatha vipassana, and it's completely non-sectarian. Now just let me finish a little bit more. But it's very important. It's not pushing Galupa versus Nyingma or Vajrayana over Maya, etc. Shamatha Vipassana is not sectarian. It's flat out, here it is. But in addition to that, and this will make it doubly unique, and I'd like to see this everywhere. I don't want it to be unique. But from the time we open the doors, we finish the cabins and we fill them with yogis. Then from the day we open, we will invite in open-minded neuroscientists, psychologists, physicists, to say, look, let's do collaborative research here. We have this group of 30 people, now they're now setting out on the path of shamatha to achieve it. Would you like to work with us in collaboration and study the brain states, the shifts in MRI, EEG, do psychological measures? Let's join forces here with your third-person methods, our first-person methods, and let's get a 3D map of all the 9 stages of shamatha, what happens when you achieve shamatha, and if on that basis extrasensory abilities, mind over matter and so forth, arise, they won't look magical. That's a big deal. They won't look magical because it's like building a laser from scratch. Then you'll see that wasn't magic, no magic, no magic, no magic. That looks magic, but it's not. And then it's now you recognize the technology. This is technology here. It's not religion, it's not philosophy, and it's not magic. It has happened in Tibet. I mean, not with scientists, but it has happened. But we always have to bear in the back of the mind or the front of the mind that when the Chinese communist genocide took place, they wiped out almost all the monasteries. I mean, they had one monastery for every 1,000 people. This would be like going to Europe and America and wiping out virtually all the universities and all the laboratories, and then laughing, oh, that science is just superstition, because you've killed all the scientists and wiped out all their labs. And of course, they're scientific materialists doing that. And so, okay, that's water under the bridge, but this has been done in the past in Tibet, but what is unprecedented is having rigorous training facility with an all very transparent. Nothing mysterious here, no samayas, no secrecy, this is shamatha. And bring in the scientists collaboratively. I would think in 20, 30 years there would be no more mind-body problem. Because it's no more intrinsically insolvable than the Earth-planet problem. You develop a telescope, it's gone. Develop samadhi, mind-body problem vanishes. I think you have one more thing to say.
Yeah, because I'm arguing, for me it's not mystical.
Yeah.
But for physicists or for scientists, it's mystical because you're not showing the link. You're showing the mind and you research on the mind, but you're not showing the link. How you actually influence mentally matter. Because there's nothing in our physics theory that gives rise to that.
Very good point.
So you have to show that because otherwise it's mystical.
Yeah, very good point. Outstanding point. And once again, what plays front and central in Hinduism for thousands of years, Mahayana Buddhism, Vajrayana Buddhism, Taoism, is prana. Prana, or in the Chinese tradition, qi. Qi's real. I was treated by a Qigong master, and what he did transcended the limits of modern science. It was inexplicable. I've been with a Tibetan yogi who spent 9 years in retreat, and he uses qi in ways that were utterly extraordinary. I mean, absolutely defined or known law of physics, but I saw it, you know? And so it's there. But the prana is the link. It's the bridge between body and mind. Because prana, especially the subtle prana that carries on from lifetime to lifetime, it is physical. It is physical. That is, it occupies physical space, it moves through physical space, and it interacts explicitly, directly with matter, but it also interacts directly with consciousness, because it's like an alloy. It's called lungsem, energy mind. It's an alloy. It's not two things slapped together. And it's the subtle lungsem that carries on from lifetime to lifetime. So it has a physical aspect to it, a cognitive aspect to it, and so it's the prana that is actually the bridge between the two. Now, I think this could be an immensely rich field of biology, but so far they've abandoned it for a reason that looked very good at the time. It was Helmholtz, the German polymath really, who discovered the law of conservation of energy. Before him, Lavoisier had studied had identified the conservation of matter. That was big, that was chemistry. But Helmholtz gave a mathematical formulation from thermal energy, electromagnetic, and so forth, that energy in all these configurations and changes, it's always conserved. So around 1860s, when he was doing his seminal work, then an idea came out with, for a very good reason, that the physical universe is causally closed, which is to say there are no non-physical influences on the physical universe, otherwise the conservation of energy would be broken, right? And so that wiped out God and angels and anything non-physical, which throws out all the supernatural, but you know what else it throws out? Your mind. Your desires, your motivations, your mental afflictions, your bodhicitta, they're not physical. So this means your mind has no influence on the brain. And there are many neuroscientists that believe that. There are what they're saying then is the brain operates solely in accordance with the laws of physics and biology. The laws of physics and biology are absolutely amoral. Amoral. The word doesn't mean anything. Therefore, your brain is an amoral organ, and your mind is simply what the brain does. Therefore, morality is just whatever the heck you say it is. So you've completely demoralized all of human existence. So I think it's pretty serious. But now, that was 1860s. That was the height, just like it was the height of the British Empire, it was also the height of scientific materialism, the ending decades of the 19th century. Lord Kelvin thought we're pretty much finished with physics. We're pretty much done here. That's before Max Planck, before Einstein, but quantum mechanics in particular, that showed suddenly with the uncertainty principle and so forth, not so fast, that there are these these quantum fluctuations out of the 0 point energy of the electromagnetic field. There are these quantum fluctuations, and on the surface it looks like they're violating the energy-time Heisenberg uncertainty principle. I think you know physics. For very brief periods, you can violate the law of conservation of energy. The shorter the period, the larger violation, and in fact, the Big Bang may in fact be such an instance. And so that airtight law from 150 years ago is no longer airtight, right? And so prana was thrown out, the vis vita, the elan vital, some kind of a life energy, kind of a life energy that was unique to living organisms, thrown out lock, stock, and barrel with the discovery of conservation of energy, right? But now, it's not so clear that that's prohibited. And if there, we have Tibetan yogis and Chinese and Hindu that really have mastery of prana. And I've seen it myself. With a Chinese Tao master, I saw it, and with a Tibetan master who spent 9 years meditating above Samye Ling. And what they can do just defies the laws of physics. So prana is the mediator. It would be biophysics. Something is biological, but it has an impact on physics, but also direct bearing on the mind, and you're controlling the flow of prana, or chi, with your mind. And what you can do with that, it's incredible. So this I'd call not paranormal, because they creep out with that word, let alone supernatural. I would simply call it relativistic. Because move it near the speed of light, and things look really magical. Things that shouldn't happen. Time warping and matter and energy. I mean, it's get really spooky, but it's not magical. Just study Einstein. It's not magical at all. And quantum teleportation. I know the man who developed that, Anton Zeilinger. That looked like magic. That looked like beam me up, Scotty, And yet it's just impeccable physics. There's no magic involved, but it is quantum teleportation. And so this is relativistic physics. It's gone beyond Newtonian, the normal. And what we need, I believe, and very passionately, is we need to develop relativistic psychology, people developing exceptional paranormal, I don't mean spooky, I mean exceptional levels of mind where they have exceptional control over prana, and they can direct their samadhi like a laser, and that's where you start seeing how the mind can manipulate matter. And what needs to happen, it has to be done under controlled experimental conditions. Otherwise, the scientists will always ask, what have you got under the sleeve? What have you got under your sleeve? You know, how did you do it? Oh, come on, tell me. What was the trick? And so, but if they're involved from scratch, so there's no little wires, there's no little tricky things. No, it's Samatha vipassana, and that's all. We got no wires here. If they're partners, because I don't want to see religion beat science, and I don't want to see science beat religion either. In fact, I don't really care that much about religion. I just love Dharma, you know. But if we work in complete collaboration, then everybody wins. And prana is the key. It's the bridge between the two worlds. Yeah, and it can be studied. Yeah. Yeah, what else?
For the benefit of many of the Buddhist students here, I'll ask one question. One is, when we do the Buddhist practice, it should be done either to benefit this life, happiness and peace, or for many lives to come.
Yeah.
Okay? Now, it is quite obvious that the practice that we do benefits our life.
Yes.
Like reducing your anger and things forth. But as you said, like when we talk about benefit for the many future lives,
Yes.
then it almost looks like groping in the darkness.
Which does? What's the noun?
Future lives.
Yeah. Oh, because we don't know what's in the future?
Yeah, when
Okay.
we talk about many lives,
Yeah.
benefiting many lives,
Sure.
then it's almost like groping in the darkness.
Understood,
Okay,
yeah.
the lost key.
Yeah. Right.
There's no light there.
I understand.
So then also the interesting or strange thing is that these days it looks like whatever experiences we have must be corroborated by scientific findings.
They would like us to believe that.
So my question to you is it necessary that whatever our experiences are, at the end of the day, must be corroborated by scientific findings? Because in this area, it is not possible. As you already mentioned, that they don't support, the stories told by, children who remember their past lives and things like that.
Yeah.
So in that case, if we don't find that support from scientific finding, which is difficult, then how can we develop that conviction? But it's easier said than done. That's why I'm asking this question.
Yeah.
How can we develop the conviction, like at least from the Buddhist teaching,
Sure.
that there is continuity of life,
Sure.
in a convincing way,
Mm-hmm.
to undertake a mass conversion? I'm joking. Yeah.
Well, when it comes to, and I join with the joke, lighthearted, but when it comes to really a whole shift in the zeitgeist, in the whole worldview, a shift of humanity, that our priorities are shifting more towards developing genuine well-being rather than just scurrying after one worldly pleasure after another. A worldview that's oriented to taking into account future lives and not fixating only on the affairs of this life. That would be much larger than the scientific revolution, right? That kind of shift. Max Planck made an interesting comment. He was the founder of quantum mechanics. And this was a massive shift. Quantum mechanics, relativity, it was a massive shift. Wes and Heisenberg said, we feel like the very ground is shaking beneath us. This was a big deal for the physicists. Because the Newtonian physics, together with electromagnetism, seemed like it was rock solid, airtight, and complete. And then Max Planck, Einstein, Heisenberg, and so on, they just torpedoed it, And so it was very difficult for the older generation, including Max Planck himself, and other brilliant physicists who were brilliant in the late 19th century. It was very difficult for them to really attend to and take seriously this new evidence coming in. And Max Planck made this comment. He said, science progresses funeral by funeral. And it's just the old ones have to die off. We don't kill them. They're going to die a natural death. But young people like you, so folkies like me, set us out to graze. We'll die off slowly, slowly. And then young people who've not yet been brainwashed into scientific materialism, but are as smart as anybody else, but have some appreciation for the contemplative wisdom of 5,000 years of Hinduism, Buddhism, but also are rigorously trained in neuroscience, physics, whatever your field is. His Holiness calls them hybrids. I'm not one. I don't have professional training, not really professional training in physics and neuroscience. Undergraduate degree in physics is not enough. But your generation, I'm seeing more and more, going the whole way. PhDs in neuroscience, psychology, physics, etc., and really being serious students of Dharma and meditating seriously. Francisco Varela is pretty close. He was much more of a scientist than a contemplative, but he took his contemplative practice seriously, and he sat at the feet of Buddhist masters with reverence. That's very rare, and I'm very sorry he's gone. And so the answer then, I think, is that there needs to be a breakdown of Eurocentric pomposity. And we're still up to our neck in it. I mean, just up to our necks. I'm amazed that it's still here, that colonialism and imperialism on this level is still so rampant. You know, it really is. And I find it quite unbearable, frankly. But your generation is not going to tolerate that. I don't think so. Mine has. So my generation organizes Buddhism science conferences where 90% of the talking is done by the scientist, and then the Dalai Lama is listening as if he's a 20-year-old. Say, oh, tell me more, master. Tell me. And he's so humble. Sometimes I want to scream. Because I'm not that humble. They should maybe listening a little bit more. But the next generation coming up, more hybrids, more openness, and recognizing that there is evidence that is credible, rigorous, replicable, authoritative, that is not physical. And my favorite analogy here, we're lingering on it, but I think you've asked a very seminal question. And one can say, but contemplative experience, who can really know who's a great yogi? Who can really know whether you've realized this or not? Unless you display a siddhi, apart from that, then who can really know? But the whole field of pure mathematics, it's entirely subjective. When Sir Andrew Weil solved Fermat's last theorem, a 150-page proof, right? How many people could follow every line of logic? A tiny minority, but those who are qualified, after he botched it once and then fixed it, those who are qualified recognize he'd actually proved it. But there's no physical evidence at all. It's entirely internal. So for highly accomplished yogis, like a Ling Rinpoche, and a Dujun Rinpoche, and a Dingwa Khensa Rinpoche, and a Tushi Rinpoche, and Chokye Tishin Rinpoche, and on and on and on, my sense is that these highly, and of course His Holiness, the highly accomplished yogis, they know who they are. His Holiness doesn't write long life prayers for anybody, but he does for Yangtan Rinpoche, for Chokye Tishin Rinpoche, and so forth. They are like these highly trained mathematicians, where it's all internal, but they recognize. And so this can be a generational movement, where we recognize, look, there's evidence that is not physical. Mathematicians have known this for centuries, and contemplatives have known this for centuries, but the mere fact that it's not physical does not mean that it can't be intersubjectively rigorous. Intersubjectively rigorous. Go through similar training, and then you discover, and you say, yep, that's what I saw. That's as rigorous as anything, and then we cross the bridge from science being equivalent to scientific materialism, and contemplative inquiry being equivalent to religion. Then we bridge it. Yes?
I would like not just a comment, because you mentioned mathematics. There was Kurt Gödel, an Austrian mathematician,
brilliant, absolutely.
who was close friend to Einstein, and he said that even mathematics, we assert some axioms are truth, but we cannot prove it. So it means the whole also structure of mathematics invented or discovered is also, there is no certainty, because we cannot prove the axiom.
I don't think it's a good paraphrase, actually. That is, Sir Andrew Weil, he basically devoted his whole life, when he was a child, he picked up a book on Fermat's last theorem that had been unproved for like 250 years. And he, for early past life imprints, I imagine, as a kid, he decided, I want to solve this problem. And it took him about 50 years, but he did. And when he presented it the first time, there was a flaw, one line of reasoning that was a flaw in a 150-page proof, and somebody picked it up, said, you didn't do it. Back to the drawing board. And then he came back and he nailed it, and then everybody said, congratulations, he becomes Sir Andrew. He got one prize after another, and so forth. I don't think that's uncertainty. Is it absolute certainty? No. But is it certainty within conventional reality? Yes. And there are many, many mathematical proofs. And they are more, for a mathematician, they're more certain than a truth based on empirical evidence, because there can always be more empirical evidence just around the corner, And so I really feel that we're right now living in an unprecedented but unprecedentedly fruitful and high potential era of human history, where if we go this way, we'll actually destroy ourselves and much of the rest of the planet, and go this way. And we may find fields of knowledge and of compassion and of value shifting in a marvelous way, where everyone wins. Buddhism is enriched by the scientific community, and the scientific community and the whole world is enriched by the discoveries by science. And His Holiness commented in Pisa, when we think, I'm paraphrasing now, but he said, when we take, for example, the great discoveries in physics, we don't think that Newton's discoveries were British truths, and Galileo's Italian truths, and Gauss German truths. Nobody thinks that, because it's transcultural. It doesn't belong to anybody. And some of the most brilliant mathematicians, like Ramachandran, Indian, and then it's not an Indian discovery. He happened to be Indian. So His Holiness is saying, similarly, the discoveries made with the technology of samadhi and the science of vipassana, they're coming from Buddhism, but they're not Buddhist, as in belonging to some religion. And they're not Indian and they're not Tibetan. You can be Argentinian, you can be simply open-minded, you can achieve samadhi. You don't have to take refuge in the Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha to achieve shamatha. And there are cases in the Pali Canon where some people would come to the Buddha seeking guidance. The Buddha gave them guidance. They put it into practice. They became stream enterers. They realized nirvana. And after realizing nirvana, they came back to the Buddha and said, I take refuge in the Buddha, in the Dhamma, and the Sangha. He did not say, if you want teachings from me, first take refuge. Let alone, first give me 100,000 prostrations. And finish the 5 accumulations. Then I'll teach. Until then, he never did that, right? He would just teach. And sometimes people would get the benefit and then they would take refuge, like going to a doctor when you have a terminal disease. The doctor cures you, and then you go back and say, you're my primary physician, which is medicine, you're my root lama. You know? So this is Buddhism. The Buddha really meant it, as the Dalai Lama's quoted probably hundreds of times by now. The Buddha never asked us to accept his teachings simply out of faith, but test it, test it, test it. And if it's sound, you'll see it's sound. If it's not, throw it out.
Thank you.
Thank you.